The federal government of Nigeria spent $3.58 billion on foreign debt servicing in the first 9 months of 2024, marking a 39.77% increase from the $2.56 billion spent in the same period in 2023, according to the Central Bank of Nigeria data. This surge underscores the growing strain on Nigeria's fiscal balance amid persistent economic challenges. The CBN's international payment statistics indicates that the highest monthly debt servicing payment this year occurred in May, totaling $854.37 million. The substantial rise in external debt obligations reflect the broader pressures facing Nigeria as it navigates rising costs and currency fluctuations in a challenging economic landscape. This morning, Segun Sopitan, Principal Partner, Woodridge Scott Consulting, joins me live in our studios. Thank you so much, Segun, for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So, what factors would you say are driving the sharp increase in Nigeria's foreign debt servicing costs? And how does this impact the nation's economic stability?
Well, I think the primary factor driving this is just the simple fact that the Nigerian government historically and almost habitually is fixated on debt as one of its most significant sources of funding its operations. So we've seen a situation where, in spite of the desperately high strain on our fiscal structure, the fiscal balance of the country in terms of what the debt service obligation does to our revenue profile, we continue to borrow. And we continue to borrow significantly. So, for example, our debt stock rose by almost 30% from Q3 2023 to Q2 2024. That's within a space of just about 6 months. We saw a 30% rise in our debt profile. So, in spite of the fact that government revenues had ballooned significantly as a result of the devaluation of the naira and as a result of the subsidy removal, we still saw the government, going out to pursue more and more loans to fund budget deficits, hopefully to fund infrastructure projects and all of that. So as long as we continue to look at debt as the primary source of funding for the government, then we're going to continue to have this problem where service obligations are significantly high and take a significant chunk of our revenues, which then, of course, impacts on the ability of the government to fund, desperately needed developmental activities. And, you can just think about the spiraling effect that would have on development and growth of the economy as a whole.
Okay. Well, the CBN also, decried the debt repayment. It's actually said that, it is straining Nigeria's fiscal balance, and some economists have equally blamed this on the continuous borrowing, like you mentioned, by the government. We are talking about also rising global interest rates, exchange rate fluctuations, and in some quarters they even blamed it on the devaluation of the naira. Do you think all these other factors also influenced the debt burden?
Yeah, I believe so. Obviously, interest rates have kind of been a bit volatile over the last 2 years. We're beginning to see global central banks go through rate cuts as these countries have begun to rein in inflation. So hopefully we'll see an impact of that on our service obligations over the next year and a half, thereabouts. But yes, absolutely, these factors are definitely affecting our debt profile and our debt service obligation challenges. I don't know that there is a link with the devaluation of the naira with this, because largely we're speaking about external debt. So if we're talking about the debt that is held in dollars, whatever you do to your naira, all that does is to strain, your government revenues further. But in terms of the quantum of the debt service obligation itself, which is foreign currency denominated, that has no bearing on that at all. It's just that we're borrowing more, and we need to, look at other avenues to fund government activities so we can stem the tide.
Okay, we'll look at the viable options in a while. But then the Global Credit Ratings Agency, that is Fitch, recently projected Nigeria's external debt servicing to rise about $5.2 billion next year. So how sustainable is Nigeria's current reliance now on domestic borrowing as an alternative to external debt?
Well, First of all, we're seeing the government do something that some of us have been advocating for a while, which is to borrow domestically but in dollars. Because what that could do is to then attract diaspora Nigerians, bring in money, into the economy, and help boost the forex for revenue, so to speak, forex liquidity within the markets. So that's a good thing. Relying on domestic borrowing, yes, I think that we do have to look inward to fund our operations, but I think that beyond relying on domestic borrowing, we should be looking away from borrowing as a whole. All governments borrow. We must not forget that. All over the world, so in fact, the biggest economies in the world and the most developed economies are usually the highest indebted. But our GDP to debt ratio standing at around 35% or so is still relatively very low compared to the likes of Japan that is trending at about 150%, the United States over 100%. So it's not that debt in itself is a problem. I think in our own case, it's the fact that there is an imbalance between, the things that we do with the debt, the revenues that those debts are supposed to create, the development that's supposed to follow it. Those things are not happening, and therefore it's a problem. We therefore should be looking away from debt as a primary source of funding government activities, given our peculiar challenges.
Okay, so now that you have said that there's a need to look away from borrowing, so to speak, according to reports, Nigeria saves about 1.4 trillion naira from fuel subsidy removal annually. And the government also said it will save 24 trillion naira a year as it has ended our fuel imports. So if we are not going to be borrowing and we have these largesse on ground due to government policies, can this actually curb borrowing tendencies and help Nigeria avoid the debt trap that some economists are warning about?
I honestly don't see the nexus. We have seen a significant growth in government revenues on the back of these two policies, controversial policies of the government, subsidy removal and devaluation of the naira. But are those increases significant enough to plug the deficits, the massive deficits that we have in our budgeting cycles? And I think the answer would be no. We're still going to see the government having to borrow unless we do something different.
But this is about 25 trillion naira. We know that there are federal allocations, and we are looking at a debt that has risen to about 120, let's say 120 thereabouts trillion. So if we begin to pay them in trickles monthly, don't you think in some way it would reduce the debt portfolio, while Nigeria can now rely on other sources to actually fund the budgets?
Well, I think that we have to remember that this 24 trillion naira saving, in quotes, that the federal government talks about will go into funding the resultant higher cost of doing things that devaluation of the naira would have resulted in for the government and for everybody else. We have to remember that the cost of running the government business has gone up significantly as a result of subsidy removal in an attempt to try to, what's that word we always use now? The subsidy
removal,
the ameliorating, steps that the government tends to take. One of the things that they've done is to increase minimum wage. And that is going to balloon, we're increasing minimum wage by almost a little over 100%. So that's definitely going to balloon government's expenses as well. Government overheads and salaries will increase. So this 24 trillion saving we celebrate, a good chunk of that is going to go right back into funding the increase in the cost of, governance and the cost of doing business in Nigeria. So I don't think that is going to do much in terms of reducing the need to borrow or our debt service obligations. So again, we've got to think, what else can we do? How else can we fund the desperately needed developmental activities, infrastructure deficits, plugging the deficit gaps, and all of that.
So then what should now be the priority of government when it comes to this debt management? Because it seems as though the options on the table are limited.
We have to, first of all, agree from a philosophical point of view as a government, as a country, that we want to move away from debt for now because of the harm it's doing to the fiscal structure of the economy. It's got to be a decision. So if we make the decision, that will be a starting point. And then you can lock yourself in a room, strategize, and begin to talk to experts from different sectors of the economy, private sector people, capital markets people. What else can we do to move away from especially these external debt obligations and increasingly borrowing from the World Bank, from the IMF? Every couple of months you hear a new $2 billion, $500 million, $1 billion loan approved by one multilateral agency or the other. We've got to move away from that. And I think the starting point will be for us to decide as a strategy that we want to move away from that. I think that, especially when it comes to funding of infrastructure and funding of developmental activities of the government, there are alternatives out there. It's just that government has got to become creative and must be willing to work very, very tight partnerships with private sector people. And maybe we can find solutions therefrom.
Okay, well, according to reports, I'm sure a lot of Nigerians don't actually know this. When you look at the debt per capita reports, Nigeria is owing 120 trillion naira. And when you calculate that, looking at the population of the country, a single Nigerian is owing about 620,000 naira. So I'm guessing Sopitan will help me. Mr. Sopitan, you just help me pay part of my own debt.
It's a very interesting statistic, but we have to remind ourselves, on a lighter note,
yes,
that's exactly what it is. But people need to know that nobody is going to come and knock on your door to come and pay your 620,000 naira share of the Nigerian debt. It's a statistic that just tells us how bad, the problem is and how in dire need of answers we are.
All right, Segun Sopitan, Principal Partner, Woodridge Scott Consulting. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.